This is Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, thanks to the company he runs, Berkshire Hathaway. Basically, it's a holding company that just owns a bunch of other companies, Geico, Dairy Queen, a huge railroad, as well as a lot of stock in other companies like Apple and Coca-Cola. So when those companies do well and their stock goes up, Berkshire Hathaway stock goes up. When Buffett took over the company in 1965, a single share was worth $19. Today, it's worth nearly $500,000. Buffett owns nearly 240,000 of these shares. This is where his wealth is. But as he's been known for pointing out, Warren Buffett still pays a lower tax rate than his secretary.
She pays at twice the rate I pay. I think that's outrageous.
That's because they pay different types of taxes. His secretary pays income taxes on her salary, but Buffett mainly pays capital gains taxes on his sold stock, and that's taxed at nearly half the rate.
The wealthy are definitely undertaxed.
For this Sunday, we're looking at not a parable of Jesus, but a riddle of Jesus. You could call this the riddle of Caesar and the coin. It's the famous story of the coin that Jesus is presented with, and he's asked whether it is lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not. And then he gives his response. So for the 29th Sunday in Ordinary Time for Year A, we're going to be looking at Matthew 22, verse 15 through 22. Then the Pharisees went and took counsel how to entangle Jesus in his talk. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and that you care for no man. For you do not regard the position of men. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the money for the tax." So they brought him a coin. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. You might notice that last verse that I just read is not in the lectionary, but again, I include it because it's an important clue for us as to the audience of this particular saying, right? And to how they responded. So Jesus here is once again speaking to the Pharisees, who were very prominent leaders amongst the Jewish people, who were testing him. They were trying to entrap him. They were trying to entangle him, literally, as the text says, in his talk. So what does that mean? This is the context of Jesus's teaching, but what's the meaning of the entrapment that they're trying to engage in? Well, in this case, the trap is really simple. They're trying to get him to give a yes or a no answer to the question of whether it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. And the reason that they're doing this is because either way he answers the question, yes or no, can get him in trouble. If Jesus, for example, says yes, it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, he could be accused by his fellow Jews of being a Roman sympathizer. You might recall that there were lots of Jews in the first century AD, especially the Zealots, who were vehemently opposed to the Roman occupation of Jerusalem and to the land of Israel. I mean, they saw the Romans as pagan overlords who had no right to be there. And they also saw, for example, Jewish tax collectors as the virtual equivalent of Gentile sinners, in part because they were colluding with the occupying forces of the Roman Empire. So if Jesus says, oh, yes, you have to pay taxes to Caesar, he can be accused of being a Roman sympathizer and fall out with his Jewish contemporaries, his fellow Jews. On the other hand, if Jesus says, no, it's not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, he could then be accused by the Romans of sedition or of rebellion against the Roman government. So by seeking a yes or no answer, the Pharisees here are trying to get Jesus into trouble, no matter what answer he gives. But as is always the case in the Gospels, you just can't trap Jesus. Don't do it. It's not a good idea, because the trap will always spring back in your own face. You're always going to end up being trapped yourself. And in this case, Jesus' response to the Pharisees, his famous response, show me the coin for the tax, is extremely powerful answer to their question. So, but again, we need a little bit of Roman context here. What's going on in this? When Jesus says, show me the denarius for the tax, he's referring to a particular kind of coin. The denarius was a small coin that would be stamped with the profile of the face of the emperor. What's cool about this is that we actually have coins that have survived from the period of Jesus' life. From around AD 14 to AD 37, the emperor, the Caesar, was named Tiberius. And he produced many of these coins that were stamped with his profile. And on these coins was an inscription. This is really interesting. And you can actually find pictures of this on the internet today, pictures of these coins. The inscription on the coin read, Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Now think about that for a second. When they hand Jesus the coin, it not only has the face, the graven image of the Roman emperor. That alone might have caused some problems with Jews because in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 4, there was a law against any graven images. And yet here is a graven image of the emperor on the coin. But even more, underneath the graven image of Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus, it not only called him Caesar, it not only called him the emperor, it called him the Son of God. Because his father, Augustus, was regarded as divine by the Romans. You might not realize this, but this is really important. In the 1st century AD, the two previous emperors, Julius Caesar and Augustus, had both been divinized. They were both elevated to the status of gods by the Roman Empire. You can see this if you read Suetonius's famous biographies of the emperors. It's called The Lives of the Caesars. When he gets to Julius Caesar and to Augustus, he calls them the life of the deified Julius and the deified Augustus, the divine Julius and the divine Augustus. So in essence, what the coin that they would have handed to Jesus would have had on it was an image of Caesar who was claiming to be the Son of God. Right? Now, in that context, think about the political and the theological ramifications of the tax that was being paid to Caesar. And so what Jesus does is something, I want to say it's brilliant, but because he's the Son of God, that sounds a little understated, but it really is. It's really ingenious. He takes the coin with all of that written on it, and he says, well, whose likeness and inscription is on this? And they say, Caesar's. And we know, again, that's true. It would have had the inscription and the profile of Tiberius on the coin. And then he says to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and to God the things that belong to God. Now, most of us recognize here that Jesus is, in a very shrewd way, giving permission to pay the tax to Caesar. He's saying, look, the money can go to Caesar. It can be paid lawfully to Caesar. And frequently, people will use this as an example for teaching and enjoining Christians to be dutiful to the state. In other words, that they need to give to the state what is due to the state, and that they should pay taxes and be contributing members of society. And that is a part of what Jesus is getting at. That's not really the heart of what Jesus is getting at. If you look at it, there's a double meaning here in Jesus' words. Because when he says that the likeness is on the coin and the inscription, the Greek word there is icon. Icon, it means likeness. And we get the English word icon from this. Okay? So when he says there that the icon of Caesar means that the coin belongs to Caesar, he's allowing for the lawfulness of paying taxes to the emperor. But by taking this image, this language of likeness, Jesus is also alluding to another occurrence of that word in the book of Genesis. You might remember in the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, God, when he makes man and woman, he says that he made man and woman in the image and the likeness of God. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament there is the same word, icon. So it says that man and woman were made in the icon of God. They are literally icons of the Creator. They bear the image and the likeness of God. So there's a double meaning here. What Jesus is essentially saying to the Pharisees in response is, you can give your money to Caesar, but you need to give your life, yourself, to God. That's why in that final verse, which the lectionary leaves out, but which I think is very important, you read these words, when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and they went away. In other words, they marveled, they wondered at the truth of what Jesus is saying, and they also marveled at the fact that they couldn't catch him in the trap. His answer was too brilliant. His answer was too shrewd.
How did people build something this incredible? How many millions of people have had their lives changed because of this place? How could anyone walk into this building and remain an atheist? At least that's what I thought. Unfortunately, many others can only wonder, how rich is the Catholic Church and why doesn't it give its money to the poor? At first glance, these may appear to be fair questions. When you look at the Vatican, look at all the land and expensive art and incredible real estate that the Church owns all around the world, it can be easy to become a bit jaded. Surely this organization is loaded and shouldn't be tax exempt, but is it really? This is Catholicism in Focus. To start off, let's try to get a grasp on what we're actually dealing with here. Heavy emphasis on the word try. The fact of the matter is that no one, not even the church itself, has any way of accurately estimating the church's wealth. Being a worldwide organization existing for centuries before careful tax records were instituted, there is unfortunately no central file that we can just look up. That said, even just a cursory glance at the church gives a pretty obvious conclusion. The church has got some enormous assets. Estimates range from 250 to 500,000 square miles of land worldwide, on which are thousands of buildings, often grand and ornate, filled with expensive art, vestments, and sacred vessels. Add that to the revenue gained from investments and donations, and we're talking about a lot of money. And that's even before we look at the wealth attached to the church's enormous reach in the world of medicine, schools, and public organizations. That's another major source of income and a long list of assets. But before we conclude that the church is rich beyond our wildest dreams, let's scratch a bit beneath the surface here. For one thing, the church is not a monolithic corporation. While obviously structured hierarchically in an ecclesiastical sense, in business terms, each diocese and local church is essentially its own independent entity. Around the world, there are roughly 2,800 dioceses, all entirely decentralized from the Vatican. Some, like the Archdiocese of Cologne, have a long history, and so may consider itself the steward of enormous assets. Other dioceses, in fact, most dioceses, are far more missionary in nature, meaning that they hold very little in assets and may actually carry considerable debt. The same goes for all the Catholic hospitals, schools, colleges, orphanages, shelters, and other institutions of the church. They may be under the direction of church leaders, but that doesn't mean the church owns or directly benefits financially from them. Just because the Pope may be the spiritual leader of it all, doesn't mean that he owns it all. In that case, let's look at the Vatican on its own, as the Pope is entirely in charge of its financial assets. Clearly, the Vatican has some riches. Why doesn't he sell them? It's a question that gets a lot of press at times, but it necessitates a further question as a response. To whom? When we look at all the assets of the church, a giant building, priceless works of art, sacred vessels used in religious rites, ancient artifacts, all of which estimated by the Vatican to be worth around $1.65 billion, we have to realize that just because something is worth a lot doesn't mean that you could actually get that money if you want it. You can't just sell the Vatican to an Italian developer. If they knock it down and build apartments, it'll make far less revenue than it was worth, and if they try to run it as is, it won't be as attractive because it's no longer the central church of Catholicism where the Pope lives. When it comes to the arts, gold, and artifacts of the church, yes, technically it is possible that the church could find dealers to sell them to, but who says the church has that right anyway? The church certainly doesn't see it that way. In 2015, Pope Francis was asked why the church doesn't sell its patrimony for the poor, and he responded as every pope in recent memory has. They are not the treasures of the church, they are the treasures of humanity. In our eyes, at least, we're nothing more than stewards and caretakers of European history, not its owners. Which, as you can imagine, comes at a price. While the Vatican Museum charges a modest €16 for tours, cheaper than the National History Museum in New York, I should add, St. Peter's Basilica itself is entirely free to enter, meaning that the cost of upkeep, restorations, and employees is largely paid for from a deficit, which the Church is entirely happy to do because it's important to preserve our history and to share it with the world. In fact, the entire budget of the Vatican, largely filled with charitable costs, runs a deficit every year. Beyond the $78 million spent on the administration of the patrimony of the Holy See in 2019, the Vatican spent $76 million on the Secretariat of State, $43 million of which was sent all around the world to diplomatic missions. $54 million went to the Dicastery of Communications, employing 530 people to transmit the message of the Pope in 40 languages over TV, radio, social media, print, and photography. $25 million went to the Congregation for Evangelization of Peoples, a department that supports churches in mission territories, $19 million of which went to Eastern Rite churches, mostly in the Middle East. $10 million went to the Vatican Library, and $7 million went to the Dicastery for promoting integral human development. That is a lot of money going towards the benefit of others, ultimately causing the Vatican to post a deficit of $13 million last year. Anyone saying that the Vatican is getting rich off this stuff is crazy. We literally lose millions of dollars every year, which presents a really interesting question regarding the Church selling all of its possessions for the sake of the poor. While seemingly altruistic and the right thing to do, one has to wonder, practically speaking, what good it would actually do. Let's say that the Vatican did try to sell everything it owned, all $1.65 billion in assets. And let's say that every diocese in the world did the same, totaling, I don't know, another $50 billion, $500 billion, $1 trillion worldwide. A lot of money for sure. Until you realize that the United States government, just one nation in the entire world, spends $1 trillion on Social Security alone every single year. Selling every asset the Church has, even at the highest estimate, would do less than the US government does in 1 year. And look at all the world would lose if it did. Besides the spiritual wonder of gorgeous cathedrals and the comfort of religious ceremonies, let's not forget that the assets of the Catholic Church allow it to be the largest charitable organization in the world, providing priceless services to the most desperate. If you're going to count every church and organization run by Catholics as an asset, then you can't forget the innumerable and irreplaceable services provided by churches, charitable organizations like Catholic Charities and Catholic Relief Services, hospitals, schools, shelters, and orphanages. Yeah, we could sell every building and give to the poor, but we actually give the poor so much more, year after year, by working in those buildings. Now, does this mean that our finances are perfect, that there's nothing we could do to be better? Absolutely not. I know for sure that there is a lot of money hidden in some of our churches being used to line some people's pockets and spent on superfluous luxury items. Like Pope Francis, I really wish we had a poor church for the poor, and I know that we're nowhere near that. But to suggest that the Catholic Church universally is rich, just sitting on a load of cash that could easily benefit the poor, is ludicrous. Our greatest riches are not liquid and are actually shared publicly with the world, and the vast majority of what we do and have is put towards the life of the poor and the mission of Christ. Sell all we have and give to the poor? I'd argue that we're already doing that.